This podcast was recorded on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Ottawandaron, and Wendat peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties.
I still have a joke.
What if we tried doing this one without a joke?
Oh, no, we need a joke.
London Dairy Supply is dedicated to affordable, quality products that are sustainable and environmentally responsible. We stay current with innovations and improvements in the dairy industry to find the best and most effective products available on the market today, always delivered with professional, friendly, and efficient service. Learn more about London Dairy Supply at londondairysupply.com.
So Adam, after I read the following passage, I'm going to ask you to tell me, where in Canada do you think this refers to? Ready?
Shoot.
One of Canada's 4 major art scenes, younger than Montreal, livelier than Toronto, vying with Vancouver in variety and sheer quantity of output, it is in many ways the most important of the 4.
So I'm guessing that given that this is a show about innovation in London, Ontario, the author is speaking about our city.
Yes, but the real surprise for this article, written by Canadian art icon Barry Lord and published in Art in America in 1969, comes in the last few sentences. They read, "Plugged into the world but conscious of the necessity to produce their own work about their own experience, London artists are indelibly Canadian and perhaps amongst the first global villagers."
I feel like Mr. Lord could be speaking about London today.
And I agree. And so over the next 2 episodes, we're going to explore what drove the innovation of art in London, both in the past and today. First up, we're going to hear about London's art collection, and you might be surprised to learn how much it actually is worth. Well, not just for London.
And we're going to hear from somebody who has written extensively on exactly the period of art that Barry Lord was writing about, including hearing how a London artist in the late 60s may have actually invented social media.
So Adam, I'm always surprised when I think about London as a major art scene, especially given its long-held reputation.
We think of London as conservative now. I think back then it was really conservative. I mean, it was, insurance capital of Canada and a very rich community.
Brian Meehan is the executive director of Museum London, which is the museum of record for both London's heritage and its art.
The collection itself goes back to the 1840s. The earliest works in the collections are from the 1840s. And those are works that were done by British officers who were stationed in London. And Victoria Park was the garrison, and so they would have been stationed there. But in their training, they learned watercolor so that they could understand the topography of the areas that they were in, and also from an engineering standpoint. But some of them actually became quite talented watercolorists and enjoyed it and, did it as a hobby.
Anyone who's interested in Canadian art can tell you that London has a number of notable artists, but our history of art making stretches back pretty far.
Probably the best known 19th century painter would be Paul Peale. And he was born here. His father was a painter, and he recognized his son had talent at an early age. So at age 14, he was sent to Philadelphia to study art. And then at 18, went to France, where he lived for the next 14 years before he died at a very young age.
Over the following 75 years, London was home to many artists, but it really wasn't until the 50s and the 60s that something started to happen. And it was really focused on 2 individuals, one living here in London and the other in Spain.
Not to put too much emphasis on Greg Curnoe, but, I think most people would agree that he was a major catalyst for what happened in London. I mean, it was happening everywhere. I mean, the late 50s, there was a kind of a rebellion against convention, and obviously the 60s have been talked about ad nauseum. But he was such a strong personality and had such wide-ranging interests, and just was able to attract people and invigorate people. And, that kind of kicked things off, and then the community sort of, it takes on a life of its own. I mean, Jack Chambers said that, when he came back from Spain, he was coming back to visit his mother who was ill, and then he was planning to head back to Spain. But when he saw what was going on here, and when he met Curnoe, he realized that this was a community that could kind of feed his creativity and he could contribute to as well. So I think, you hate to sort of put it on to one person because it was a community. But you could see when Jack Chambers, when he talked about coming back to London in the early 60s from Spain, he was here to visit his mother who was sick, and he fully intended to go back to Spain. But when he came here and met Curnoe and saw what was happening, he decided this was a really vibrant arts community that could feed his practice and he could make a contribution to. So it's, Curnoe is very important. But there just seemed to be a whole number of people in London who wanted to make things happen.
Not that this was an easy place to be an artist even back then. As Brian noted, London was a super conservative town. Don't forget that John Robarts, who was the MPP for London North Centre and who went on to become Premier of Ontario from 1961 to 1971, was a big C conservative.
This meant that, like everywhere, there were conflicts between young artists and the quote-unquote establishment.
I don't know if they were fighting the world, but I think they were carving a place out for themselves in the world that wasn't what was normally expected of artists. I mean, if you were an artist at that time, for the most part, I think the expectation is that you would aspire to the international. You would aspire to the whatever was, sort of the movement of the day. Whereas they just, they decided they were going to do something completely different. In terms of the London Art Gallery, they had a bit of a contentious relationship, a number of them. I mean, there were a couple fairly highly publicized run-ins with Claire Bice, who was the curator at the Art Gallery from 1940 to 1973. And I think he had a more conservative view of things. So, I mean, there was the infamous happening that took place at the gallery when it was still on Queen's Ave, where basically the arts community trashed the place. And then there was also the annual competitions where, John Boyle had submitted a piece that Claire thought was inappropriate for the exhibition, wouldn't allow in, and there was a big to-do about that. There was a controversy about how the awards were given on an annual basis. And artists came in and withdrew their works from the show. So, there was definitely friction, I think, between the kind of official establishment and the artists at the time.
Eventually, this fledgling group of young, rebellious artists had a name. They were called the Regionalists, and they weren't just rebelling against London's conservatism. You'll hear in the rest of the episode, they were prepared to take on national and even international institutions.
Despite the big and small C conservatism of London, the museum and a number of artists found strong support among a few of London's civic and business leaders, and it's left a legacy that has lasted until today.
In fact, there was one specific couple that felt so strongly about supporting the arts, they told the city that if they could build a world-class facility, they would donate their collection. To give you a sense of the value of that collection, the City of London decided to build Museum London to hold all of that art.
Back in the 40s. And Jake was best known in London as being the president of Labatt. He also went on to be president of Brass Can. But they were a couple who loved art, and probably they were the most significant collectors of art in London. And over the years, we've received, I think it's about 920 works from the Moors. It's about 20% of our collection came from this one collecting couple. And they were supportive of artists. They had wide-ranging collecting tastes. So, I mean, they collected in-depth locally, but they collected nationally and internationally. it was just part and parcel of their lives. And they were also very aware collectors as well. So they donated their collection to the museum, but on top of that, they realized that a donation is never free. So they created an endowment that allows us to take the investment income from that and use it to maintain the collection that they gave, to research it. We can even use it to add works to the collection if they're kind of significant works that fill in the gaps of what they gave us.
Today, the collection boasts an impressive 5,500 works of art, and Brian estimates the value at between $80 and $100 million. Interestingly, it's not just the residents and visitors in London that get to reap the benefits of the collection.
I think we're recognized as having one of the better collections in the country, and just based on, I think you could base that on the requests that we get for loans to exhibitions. So, on a fairly regular basis, we're sending works from the collection out right across the country and sometimes internationally to exhibitions that other curators are putting together. So it's been recognized as a very strong collection.
It's been nearly 50 years since Barry Lord's article came out, but Brian Meehan actually sees very little difference between the London of now and the London of then.
I might say it's a little quieter because the world is quieter. I mean, I don't think I think the regionalist movement, and I think the arts community in the late 50s and 60s was as much a response to that time in London as it was a response to just kind of the zeitgeist of the time. And that kind of drove, if you've got protests in the streets over civil rights and the war and all these kind of things that are happening, it's a very volatile time. And I think the arts community at the time was kind of a response to some of that. Right now, even though there are a lot of things happening in the world, I don't think the arts communities necessarily respond in that way. So it's hard to kind of compare the two times. I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening in London. I think the caliber of artists that we've got in the community today is very, very high. And, again, we have quite a number of nationally and internationally recognized artists in London. London's it's a pretty remarkable community. It's always kind of punched above its weight in terms of what's come out of this community, in terms of the art that's made here and the artists who have lived here.
We'll put a bunch of museum-related links at towardslondon.com.
London Dairy Supply is dedicated to affordable, quality products that are sustainable and environmentally responsible. We stay current with innovations and improvements in the dairy industry to find the best and most effective products available on the market today, always delivered with professional, friendly, and efficient service. Learn more about London Dairy Supply at londondairysupply.com.
As Brian mentioned, when it comes to the regionalist movement of the 1960s in London, there were a lot of elements, both locally and globally, that contributed to that very unique time.
The 60s was a period of great change. I lived through it. It was the sexual revolution. There was the Vietnam War. Expo 67 came along. We had a new Canadian flag. There was a whole new sense of nationalism. And Greg took interest in all of those things. He wasn't just focused on his own backyard. He was very aware of what was going on elsewhere.
Judith Rodger is a freelance curator and art historian, and her storied career has seen her as chief curator at the London Regional Art Gallery, now known as Museum London, and in a variety of roles at other institutions, including the Art Gallery of Ontario, and as acting director of the Mackintosh Gallery at Western University.
The Greg she's speaking about is Greg Curnoe, who, along with Jack Chambers, were among the best-known artists to emerge from that era.
When putting this episode together, Shobhita and I looked at all the artists, all the writers, even some of the patrons, and there were just too many to pack into a half hour.
So for this episode, we're only going to focus on Chambers and Curnoe as representatives of the regionalists, but we may look to release longer-form interviews in the future if there is enough demand. demand.
As for Judith, after leaving the London Art Gallery, her education and her interests brought her to the Art Gallery of Ontario, or AGO, where she embarked on a very special project.
That led into cataloging Jack Chambers' archives. And I commuted back and forth to the AGO, actually for 5.5 years, because after I did the Chambers archive, by then they had the Curnoe archives. So then I started cataloging the Curnoe archives, which were massive, actually, and a wonderful resource because they elucidate the work and the period and to some extent what Greg was thinking.
All this research led Judith to a unique understanding and definition, not only of their work, but of the regionalist movement in general.
Well, I probably would be best to define it the way Greg defined it. It has nothing to do with the previous art movement in the 1930s, particularly in the United States, that was labeled American regionalism. I don't think Greg even knew about that. What it was working in your own backyard, so to speak. Greg trained in Toronto at the Ontario College of Art. Then in 1960, he came back to London, convinced that he didn't have to go to Toronto or New York or some other center in order to be an artist. He wanted to draw his art from his own life, particularly, and his own region. But London was uniquely situated, I've now come to realize, not having grown up here, because you're surrounded. London is basically a peninsula surrounded by the United States. And so Greg would have been aware of this cultural imperialism, for lack of a better term, that was coming from the United States. And he was very anxious to kind of maintain Canadian culture. And we're still fighting those battles. As we speak today, they're starting the NAFTA talks. So it's something that he was very aware of. And also Greg said that because London was what he called a backwater, was helpful, because you have to think back that London was a very, very conservative city. I certainly noticed that when I moved here in 1967 from Montreal. It was quite different. And so they were able to kind of do their own thing. And when the local art galleries didn't respond in the way they thought they should to their work, Greg started his own gallery, the Region Gallery, along with the other artists. It was an artist-run gallery in the front of a framing shop. And so that lasted for a little while, but they put on several exhibitions, and it was uncurated. So there was no institutional presence, which is what they wanted.
Curnoe quickly became the center of the regionalist art community in London, opening his studio, the first dedicated art studio in London, to anyone and everyone who wanted to visit.
And Curnoe's leadership didn't end at London's borders. He felt it was time that London started to receive national attention.
He also had the bravado to write to the National Gallery in 1965, I think it was, to say that he thought it was time they acquired one of his works. And I think this was really what put London on the national scene, because Pierre Théberge, a brand new curator who later went on to be the director of the National Gallery, came to London to see Greg's work in the studio. And eventually he reserved the camouflage piano of French Rondel's piece from 1966 on the spot. And it was one of two works that he presented in his first presentation as a new National Gallery curator.
Curnoe also designed the Centennial Cake in 1967 that was cut by the Secretary of State, Judy LaMarche. But he never forgot to make sure his fellow London artists shared that success, particularly when the new curator of the National Gallery came to London for a studio visit.
Greg was very generous. So when Pierre Théberge came to see him, he said, well, you can't just come and see me. You have to see all these other studios. So he took him around to all the other artist studios. And that's how the Heart of London show came about, with 11 artists from London, Ontario. One woman, Beverly Lambert Kelly. And so you can see, I hope, how he was really sort of at the heart of things.
But that's when things took a turn. In 1968, Curnoe got a commission to do a mural in Dorval Airport in Montreal, the International Arrivals Tunnel.
You know, I've flown into that airport. I didn't know there was a Curnoe piece there.
Yeah, well, there isn't. Curnoe never really lost the sense that Canada was in danger of losing its national identity to Americans. There were lots of American companies buying up Canadian firms, not to mention the early domination of our media, things like TV and radio. Plus, there was the Vietnam War.
So I'm guessing the mural wasn't popular.
Nope.
So what happened was the planes would be lined out from the airport, and then you would go down into this tunnel, and there was a moving sidewalk that would take you into the main terminal. And so he did this very long, I think it was 120 feet long mural in 26 panels on metal. And he did this from October until March when he started to install it. So they had only got to the fourth panel when trouble broke out. And it was because of the texts. There were 4 texts. When we look at it today, it seemed very innocuous, but it was the U.S. customs officials, I think, and some of the security guards who first started to make a fuss.
Okay, what could possibly have been so offensive about that text?
Well, there were 3 or 4 different discrete panels, but they were all clearly a vision of America from Greg's nationalist Canadian point of view.
The one that maybe would be the clearest to understand is it was during the Vietnam War. We're talking about 1967-68. And Cassius Clay, who later became Muhammad Ali, was the boxing champion whose title was stripped from him because he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. And I think he went to jail, actually. And so Greg had a panel about that. And that was not popular because the Vietnam War was going on. But there were also overlays, because it was about flight and about the blimp. There was a quote from the First World War, which was about the heart of London must be hit, which was a quote from the Germans about London, England, not London, Ontario. This has been misunderstood. And so this was there was a direct hit on a kindergarten in London also, which was part of the text. Then probably the last straw was that there was a man at the very end, and the propellers had real propellers, such as there were on the blimp, that were turning. They were motorized, and one of them had chopped off the hand of one of the passengers. So there was a trail of blood, and the passenger, who Greg always insisted was his neighbor, Jack, bore a very strong resemblance to Lyndon Johnson. So that was the final straw.
In the end, the mural was only up for 4 days. After that, it was dismantled and shipped off to the National Gallery, where it remained in a vault for over 30 years, until it was shown publicly for the first time at Museum London.
Now, wasn't Curnoe also part of a founding of some sort of National Canadian Artists Union, a guild or something like that?
You're talking about CAR, or the Canadian Artists Representation. Actually, it's a common misconception that it was Curnoe. It actually, among others, was Jack Chambers, who had moved back from Spain and had been living in London for quite some time. But once again, the National Gallery was at the core of this story.
The National Gallery decided that they were going to put together packages of slides of Canadian artists and send them out to schools and various other organizations across the country as part of their mandate to promote Canadian art. So they wrote to Jack and asked him if he would send some slides, but they didn't offer to pay him. And Jack decided that he was going to make an issue of it. So he wrote to them and said he would like to be paid. And they said that, they didn't have the money or whatever. And out of that came the Canadian Artists Representation, which is colloquially known as CAR, or CARFAC when you get the French version of it. So it was founded by Jack Chambers, Tony Urquhart, and Kim Ondaatje. It's often thought that Greg was one of the founders, but he was not. It was those 3, Tony, Jack, and Kim. And they had conferences, and they wrote to other artists, and they got a lot of support. And eventually, Greg was always supportive of the idea, and eventually he became the Ontario representative.
So were Jack Chambers and Greg Curnoe pals? I mean, I've seen their work, and I can't imagine them having a lot in common.
Well, remember that odd couple thing from episode 2? Get ready to bring it out again.
Oh, no, they're not similar at all. And they came from different points of view. The Victoria Hospital is probably the best way to think about that, because Jack took his photo of Victoria Hospital for his work from the roof of Greg's studio. And then they originally planned, well, they did actually, they worked back with the paintings back to back in Greg's studio because Jack's work was very large as well. And then Jack was ill, as we know, with leukemia, and he couldn't do it anymore. So he finished the work in his own studio. But the two couldn't be more different. I mean, Jack's is a brooding, winterish look at Victoria Hospital, very realistic. Greg's is, you can recognize Victoria Hospital, but it's totally what we call non-local color. So a tree could be pink, a car could be yellow, whatever he felt like doing, he would use those colors. Plus, it's covered with numbers, such as there's a postcard in his archive that someone sent to him, a tourist postcard with a similar thing where famous things on the face of the postcard were numbered so you could tell what they were. So that's what he did. And there are, I've forgotten offhand, but maybe 50 to 80 numbers on the works. And the numbers refer to various things that happened while he was doing the paintings, or in some cases, it's the room in the hospital is noted where Jack Chambers was or where his father was.
So as you can see, Curnoe's interests weren't just limited to taking on the man in the Canadian art scene. He was really interested in capturing the world around him, the very local, reachable world. This led him to keeping a journal of his daily life, just a simple catalog of the day's activities and observations. No musings, no inner dialogue.
Curnoe wanted to be able to share these thoughts in real time. It's like Barry Lord said in that article. He was a pioneer global villager. And in some ways, he, like Marshall McLuhan, understood the future even before the rest of society and technology had caught up.
And so in 1968, when he met John Hart, who was in Western's computer science department, Curnoe had an idea.
So this led to Greg's going up every day to the computer science department and typing his journals into a computer where a program had been specially designed for him by a man called Mike Dowdy. And then, interestingly, he couldn't work there because there were no windows in the room that he had given him with the computer. And Greg always had the experience of being next to a window when he was working. So the next thing was to have a terminal put into his studio at 38 Weston Street that was hooked up through the telephone to the mainframe at Western so that he could continue to type his journals in. And the archives are full of printouts he didn't want it tidy. It's, he would make mistakes. He would stroke things out. He would change his mind. And so that was really quite something in 1968, if you think about it, because what he was talking about was basically what we all do now with Twitter and Facebook, is sharing things with others about his life. He was doing it when he died in 1992. There was no internet in our homes. So that's what I'm saying. He really was innovative in that, even thinking about it. I remember going through the archives where he was writing things about these thoughts and thinking, oh my goodness, Greg, if you just lived for even a few more years, you would have seen all of this come true, what you were thinking was happening. Now, to be fair, he was talking to the computer scientists who probably had some idea where things were going. But he still, I don't know of anybody else who did anything like that in 1968.
Judith's latest book, an ebook about the life and works of Greg Curnoe, is available for free at the Art Canada Institute's Art Book website. We'll drop a link to the ebook and some others you might be interested in at towardslondon.com.
Next week, we're going to continue to explore why, in the words of Barry Lord, London, Ontario has what everywhere else needs, with Madeleine Lennon, an art historian who walked through the era with the regionalists.
And we're going to speak with Dr. Joel Faflick, whom you may remember from the first episode, as he talks about why London is such a rich mine for artists even today.
Big thanks to Brian Meehan from Museum London.
And of course to Judith Rodger. We listen to all your suggestions and ideas, so find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or send us an email, info@towardslondon.com.
If you have a chance, please rate and review us on iTunes. It makes a big difference.
Thanks to our sponsor, London Dairy Supply, and to Sammy Roach, who helped us out with some production support back at Webisodes.
Until next week, I'm Shobita Sharma.
And I'm Adam Kaplan. This has been a Webisodes podcast.